Right, good morning, Year 10. Welcome to the last lesson of this half term. All you've got to do is get through one more day and then you can have a week off. So today, for our science lesson, we are going to look at selective breeding, okay? So what you need to be able to understand by the end of this lesson is what the term selective breeding means and why farmers might be interested in doing selective breeding. We're also going to look at genetically modified organisms too, and we're going to work through a 6-mark exam question together, but I'm going to help you do that, so don't worry about it. Okay, so before we get started, have a little look at this brain teaser. If identical twin brothers married identical twin sisters, would all their children look the same? What do you think? Maybe you agree with one of these people. So we've got all the children would look identical. The children would have some similarities, but still differ. All the children would look completely unlike from each other, and the children would have an equal chance of looking the same or different. One of those is actually correct, 3 of those are wrong. So why don't you pause here for a minute, decide which one of those you think is correct. If identical twin brothers married identical twin sisters, would all their children look the same? One of those statements is right. So pause here, have a little think, and when you're ready, press play and we'll look at the correct answer. Okay, so here is the answer. The answer is that the children will have some similarities but still be different. Everyone has dominant and recessive genes. So even 2 identical twins, although they share DNA, they both have alleles in their DNA that they're not actually expressing. In order to reproduce, we have to create sperm cells and egg cells, and we do that using meiosis. And when we do that, a random selection of our alleles, whether they are the ones we're using or the ones we're not using, are then passed into those sperm and egg cells, and they go on to fertilize together to create the zygote, which forms into the embryo and the baby. So just because they're identical twins doesn't mean they're going to pass on the same alleles in their sperm and egg cells as each other. So the children would look similar, as brothers and sisters normally do, but they would still be different. Okay, so let's have a little think about what we mean by selective breeding. So normally in nature, animals would breed together and reproduce quite randomly, and they'd mix up all their genes and they'd all end up looking quite similar. But human beings, with our knowledge of genetics, we can stop that random breeding and we can control which individuals are allowed to breed together and reproduce, and therefore we can control what characteristics are passed on to the next generation. So have a little look at these dogs here. At the top left, we've got a Labrador, and underneath the Labrador, bottom left, we've got a Poodle. So both those breeds of dog tend to have their own characteristics. They have their own look and body shape, and Labradors tend to have short fur, straight fur, and Poodles tend to have curly, wiry fur. And if we breed together a Labrador and a Poodle, we get a Labradoodle. And a Labradoodle on the right there is actually sharing characteristics with both of its parents. So it has the face shape of a Labrador, but it has wiry fur like the Poodle. So the key points here are that we have selectively bred them together. We chose them, and we did that because we wanted offspring that shared characteristics of both the parents. And that is what selective breeding is all about. Okay, welcome to our next activity. This is what I like to call the cow dating agency. So let's imagine you're a farmer. You've got 4 different cows, there they are on the screen. You've got 4 different bulls, they're there as well. And because you're the farmer, you can breed together any of those cows with any of those bulls in any way that you choose. But each of those cows and each of those bulls has their own particular characteristics. They're not all the same. So let's have a little look at each of our characters here. So let's start with Gertrude. She produces extra creamy milk, but not much meat. We've got Alma, lots of meat, good milk production, but her milk sours quickly. That just means it goes off quite quickly. We've got Penelope. She's got little meat, but produces milk that contains lots of extra vitamins and minerals. And then lastly, for the cows, we've got Betsy. She has low milk production, but lots of tasty meat. In the blue corner, we've got the bulls. We've got Bruiser. He can be violent, he has lots of muscle, he can't survive in hot, dry conditions, but does very well in a damp climate. Then we have Rufus. He can cope extremely well in hot, dry conditions, he has little meat, but is very tasty. Then we've got Donald. He has lots of meat, can survive well in temperate climates, comes from a family line of cattle that produce high quantities of milk. And lastly, Boris. He's a big boy, isn't he? He's got lots of muscle, but he can cope with hot and dry conditions, and his family line does not produce much milk. So as the farmer, your job is to decide which bull and which cow to breed together to get the offspring. And on the screen there we've got 4 different desired characteristics. So let's look at the top one first. You want offspring with lots of meat and creamy milk. The animal should be able to survive in hot, dry climates. So what you need to do, you'll have to rewind a little bit and just have a look at the previous picture. You need to decide which bull and which cow you would mate together to get offspring that will produce lots of meat, creamy milk, and can survive in hot and dry climates. And then below that, you've got 3 other characteristics that you want for your offspring. And for them, you also need to decide which bull and which cow breed together. Just to help you out, all of the bulls and cows are all used only once. There's no repetition. So spend a few minutes working out which bull and cow you're going to breed together. And when you're ready, if you pause the video and scroll down, you'll be able to add your answer to the question underneath this video. When you've worked out all 4 that you're going to breed together, you can press play and we'll carry on. Okay, so we're going to talk briefly about cloning. So cloning is when you have an exact genetic copy of an organism. So you'll have 2 living things with identical DNA. And in animals, this can be done in the lab in 2 different ways. So firstly, we can split a fertilized zygote in half. Remember, a zygote is the single cell that you have after fertilization has taken place. And if you split that cell in half, you then have 2 cells with the same DNA, and you can go on to create 2 living organisms. And that is exactly how twins are formed naturally when the zygote splits in half and they both go on to produce an embryo and then a baby. The other way of creating a clone in the lab is to take some DNA from a body cell. So you take the DNA out of a cell and then you insert it into an empty egg cell. So you take an egg cell, remove from that the DNA that's already in there, and then you put into that egg cell the DNA from a body cell, and that cell will reproduce by mitosis and then go on to produce a live offspring. So in some plants, cloning happens naturally. That's their way of producing asexually. Strawberries are an example of a plant that does this. So a strawberry plant will send out a shoot. It's called a runner, and it travels along the soil, embeds itself into the soil near the original plant, and then separates, and a new plant grows from that runner. And that is asexual reproduction, because the runner that grew from the original plant that embedded in the soil and separated to become the new plant has exactly the same DNA as the original plant, so the 2 plants are clones of each other. Okay, we're going to talk now about genetic engineering or genetic modification. So if we think back to earlier to the cow dating agency, you were choosing 2 cows to breed together based on their combined characteristics. So you wanted offspring that had a combination of the characteristics of the 2 parents. And pretty much all the food that you eat has been grown in this way. So every piece of meat you eat, every piece of fruit and vegetable you eat is the result of hundreds of years of selective breeding. And genetic engineering is basically our modern way of doing the same thing, but much faster and with a wider range of different organisms. So rather than breed 2 living things together, we simply look at the DNA of one organism, find the gene that controls the characteristic that we're interested in, and we cut that gene out of the DNA and insert that gene into a different living thing, which will then have that characteristic because it has that gene in its DNA. So as an example of what you might do with this, we've got a cabbage plant there on the screen. And if you're a cabbage farmer, you really don't like caterpillars, because caterpillars come along and they eat your cabbages before you've managed to harvest them and sell them, and that costs you a lot of money. So in order to solve this problem, we took some DNA out of a scorpion, and scorpions produce poison that kills caterpillars. So we looked at the DNA of the scorpion, we found the gene in the scorpion's DNA that produces the poison. We inserted that DNA into the DNA of the cabbage plant, and then we grew cabbages that produce poison that kills caterpillars. So now when the caterpillars try and eat the cabbages, they're actually poisoned by the cabbages. And here's some more examples of genetic engineering. So inserting human genes into a sheep DNA so that they produce a chemical in their milk that's useful for treating lung disease. We've genetically engineered chickens that have 4 legs and no wings. They probably taste nice, but you can't catch them. We've genetically engineered a goat with spider genes that create silk in its milk. And very common and very useful, we've genetically engineered crops that are resistant to disease. Okay, we're doing really well. We're just going to pause here and see if we can identify 3 benefits to genetically modified organisms. Now, they're all things that we've talked about. So think about the cabbage plant. The cabbage plant was getting eaten by caterpillars, and that is what we would call a pest. So a caterpillar is a pest because it eats the crops. So that's pest control. On the screen right now, we've got at the bottom there, genetic engineering has produced crops that are resistant to disease. So as well as being resistant to pests, our crops can be resistant to disease. And at the top there, we had an example of genetically engineering an animal so that the produce that we take from that animal gives us a health benefit. So the next question underneath the video, question 5, asks you to choose 3 benefits of genetically modified organisms, just the things that we've just recapped. So just pause here, scroll down to that question and choose 3 of those statements that are benefits of genetically modified organisms, and then come back and press play when you're done. Okay, so as with most things, it's not all benefits. There are some negative aspects to genetically modified organisms and crops. And we're just going to talk quickly about the negative aspects of genetic engineering. So there's some information on the screen there. The first part of that really is just talking about what we've already discussed. And you can pause and read through that if you want to. About halfway down that paragraph, it mentions that the seeds for genetically modified crops and plants are very expensive. So if you're a farmer and you want your genetically modified cabbage so that it's resistant to caterpillars, that will cost you a lot of money. One of the other concerns with genetically modified crops is that some people think that genetically modified crops will spread out of farms and start reproducing with natural plant varieties, and this could have unknown consequences for wild plants. And lastly, some people believe that eating genetically modified organisms such as plants and crops from farms may be bad for human health, although there's no evidence to support this. So your next task is to go down to the next question and identify the 3 problems or issues with genetic engineering. So pause whilst you do that and then press play for the last section. Okay, so your very last task today for science, in fact, your last task for science for this half term is to answer this 6-mark question. So the question says, discuss the advantages and disadvantages of the use of GM organisms. Remember, GM is just genetically modified organisms. Now, before you tell yourself that you don't know where to start and you're not sure how to answer this question, I want you to realise that you already know exactly how to answer this question, because if you look back at the previous 2 questions that you've already answered, everything you need to know is already there. Because you've already told me for 3 marks all the benefits and advantages of genetically modified organisms, and you've also just told me for 3 marks all the disadvantages and issues with genetically modified organisms. So all you need to do for 6 marks is to put all of that knowledge together in one paragraph, and you should be able to get 6 out of 6 for this exam question. And when you've completed that 6-mark question, that is the end of the lesson, and that is the end of science for this half term. I know it's not easy working from home, so thank you for all the effort you've put in. It is appreciated. Well done. Have a fantastic half term, and I will see you soon.